Hello and welcome to another episode of our Black Gay Diaspora podcast. I'm your host, Eric. Our guest for this episode is the Honorable Dr. Maurice O'Brien Franklin, a distinguished public policy and public administration adjunct professor at California State University, Northridge, or CSUN. He's also CEO and president of Franklin Management, lecturing and consulting on organizational sustainability and organizational development strategies throughout the United States. Dr. Franklin's career spans over 20 years and includes senior management roles with legacy African-American nonprofit organizations. Some of these are memberships in Manhattan's Community Board 10, the second vice president of the Harlem Hospital Community Advisory Board, a board member of the Prince Hall Medical Foundation, and the chair of health and wellness for the founding chapter of 100 Black Men in Harlem. I feel like I am not doing enough in my life today. Dr. Franklin is also community advisor to the City University of New York Graduate Center's Harlem Strong Community Mental Health Project. He's also held advisory roles with former mayors Mike Rawlins in Dallas, Texas, Bill Campbell in Atlanta, Georgia, and Marion Barry in Washington, D.C. In 2023, Dr. Franklin received accolades from the Oklahoma Press Awards for his critiquing in the January 7th, 2023 police killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee. As the second openly gay executive staffer for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. Franklin founded the Black AIDS Institute, the National Black Justice Coalition, and the CNP Presents Second Sunday podcast, three nationally recognized nonprofit organizations. Dr. Franklin attributes his activism and social justice commitments to the influences of his mother, James Baldwin, Reverend Jessie Jackson, and early 20th century Jamaican activist Marcus Garvey. Safe to say, Dr. Franklin himself contributes to his communities, and I look forward to learning more about who he is, as well as discovering if there are any connections with our families in Oklahoma. Hey, Dr. Franklin, and welcome. How are you?
Thank you so much for reading that. It's sometimes when you're writing things down, you don't really get the full impact. And so that was quite a lot that you read about my commitment to the community and the work that I'm engaged in. I appreciate hearing that. I'm doing fine today. Thank you for this invitation. I'm looking forward to sharing.
Just in reading, your professional credentials and accolades, great that we've connected and looking forward definitely to this conversation. If I remember correctly, you are based in New York.
I am. I live in Harlem. I live on Malcolm X Boulevard, right in the center of what I call the heartbeat of Black America. I have lived here for over 30 years, not far from where Baldwin walked the grounds and not far from where the March on Washington office was, where Bayard Rustin lived on 130th Street, not far from where Garvey started his organization on 137th Street. I live close to where I consider the giants, Ralph Ellison from Oklahoma. I'm close to where all of that energy was during the Renaissance and throughout the 20th century. So it feels like I'm on hallowed ground every time I walk out of my apartment.
You remind me of a couple of people I've interviewed from the UK when they talk about Brixton, hearing all of that rich Black history.
Quite a bit of history between those Blacks who live in Brixton, American activists. There's a solidarity and union that we share with each other. So that's a great event.
They all have definitely shared how much they've been influenced by Black culture, Black American culture.
Absolutely. And I've been inspired by their unapologetic, Africanness. That's certainly been something that's impacted me in how I view the world as a Pan-African person living in the U.S. I consider myself centered in sort of my African culture. So they certainly inspired me in that.
Can you explain for those who may not know what Pan-Africanism is?
It's a term that was really coined at the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, a connection of Africans throughout the diaspora that were connected through our world experiences in Africa, the culture of Africa that has influenced us. And so as a Pan-African, I see the worldview in my self-centered, as an African who was enslaved, brought to the U.S. And so I'm centered in a worldview that says Africa for me is home.
In that framework, You had access to so much history.
We have to, but it's not access that's easily identified, as a child. It's something that I've had to acquire as an adult. The more reading and just really connecting myself and centering myself. We're not much centered here in the U.S. There's so much in our marketing and the media and things that we see that tell us that we're not valuable. And so coming to that realization that, we come from a group of people who are survivors and who, lived throughout the ages centered in Africa, it makes me personally, and I think it enriches my life, but it also strengthens me in terms of who I am. Critical thinking and cultural affirmation. It's important to be able to affirm our identity. And many people felt limited, that they knew that they were enslaved. And certainly, historians and white historians, genealogists, think that Black Americans can't trace their ancestry back beyond 1865, which is a slap in the face. We are able to trace our identities and legacies all the way back to Africa. But, for them, that's saying that we don't know who we are. And so there's a lot of work to do. Take the stigma away from institutional racism and the impact that slavery's had on us. We're able to get much further, and to deconstruct that helps us as a community and our own rich history and our own identity.
You're in the heart of a lot of important Black historians in New York, but also with it being Pride Month, where a lot of LGBT movements got their foothold. How's your Pride Month been so far?
I'm always able to reflect back on the history of Black Americans and center our rich history and culture and our contributions to gay liberation. I also have a little ambivalence, these days as one who's getting older. There's an arc of my experience and the work that I've done. And so I note with concern that there are a lot of organizations now that are with Black gay men that are creating awards and honors and acknowledgement that, for the most part, some of these individuals were absent during the immediate needed work around HIV and AIDS, and many of them were self-hating. I'm a little disappointed sometimes when I realize that there are a lot of people that are getting these awards and honors or have created these honor groups. They weren't involved, they were absent, and maybe were part of the problem in the late 80s and 90s. So I've been here long enough to know who was engaged and who wasn't. But it's the history will record where they were 30 years ago.
When you say absent from, are you saying like just solely focus on the larger community, keeping us out of certain spaces, or just us doing our part?
I think there were a lot of Black gay men who are well known today were not contributing to the health of our community 30 years ago. That a lot of the work that they were doing was anti-gay, absolutely anti-gay 30 years ago, that they were not friends to those of us who were out, and we couldn't rely on them for their support. Those individuals who had access, power, money, we could have used them 30 years ago because perhaps their contribution could have been during that time, it could have made a landmark difference. Maybe less people would have suffered in our community. I'm glad they're out. But 30 years ago, their contribution made a big difference in our community.
Okay. Thank you for forwarding me the article in The Reckoning, CMP, The Reckoning, where you shared your history with the movement, with getting the education out there and the knowledge, and then some of your own background. Can you share some of that? Like when it first came onto the scene, this awareness of this new disease, where you were at?
Well, I'm from Oklahoma. I was a student at the University of Oklahoma. I remember maybe in the spring of 81 that I was hearing about people that lived on the East and West Coast beginning to die or getting sick from a virus. And certainly during that time period, I was hearing, well, if you don't sleep with a white gay man, you're going to be okay. I was very cautious. I had a few friends that died during that time period. And so for me, I didn't know what to do. I knew I wanted to get out of Oklahoma, so I joined the military. I joined the Navy, worked as a medic, and was stationed at a hospital in North Virginia. So the early stages of HIV and AIDS from 1981 to 1987, 88, I was working directly with sailors and Marines who were first testing positive with the HTLV virus. They would come to our hospital in Portsmouth, Virginia. And because I was, working in quality assurance in the hospital, but I just had this yearning to want to help these guys who were in this other building. They bring them in from off the ship or wherever they were stationed. They would be there for 2 weeks getting all of these various tests that would test our immune system and their immune responses. And so my job and duty at that time was to help the nurses and doctors by providing education information. So I would research and provide them with nutrition, immune system information, the kinds of information they could translate into education material for those individuals. Well, I found myself not just providing the information, but I would end up over there lingering because these guys looked just like me, Black, Native American, white, where they were gay men. I lingered over there and developed friendships. I want to save their life. I ended up getting a boyfriend, a boyfriend that was over there as well, who passed in 93, 94, but was the love of my life at that time. So that was probably a good place for me to begin that work, my work in HIV and AIDS, working from the federal government, from the Department of Defense. I had information, I had access, and I was able to, directly impact. I don't know that I changed anybody's quality of life, but I certainly developed friendships with people who I knew had a diagnosis that at that point we thought was death. It was death at that point. But to see the resilience in those individuals, they hadn't given up. They were moving forward with their life. They were doing the best they could with the information they had to make each day count from that time period. And of course, I translated, my work in the 80s to the American Red Cross, doing some of the similar things, working with the National Red Cross on a strategy to educate and inform all their chapters across the United States and the Caribbean. We created entire modules and training to try to make sure that volunteers and staff would be armed with the resource information to kind of dispel the stigma, but also provide support to families and individuals who were infected and affected by the virus. So I spent most of the 80s being in the fire. I had a choice. I could have just stayed in that one office that I was in and pretended like it didn't exist, but it was so strong for me. These people were my contemporaries. And so I metaphorically and literally ran into the burning building. I've never left the burning building, even today. A lot of the work that I do is designed around helping those that are least of us in our community. And it might not necessarily be HIV and AIDS disease. It could be COVID. It could be the MOX vaccine and getting people vaccinated. It could be about infant mortality or child maternal health. I have just a heart for advocacy and to understand the health inequities in our community. The HIV AIDS movement, as a practitioner, as a social thinker, as an activist, that's where I was able to, learn hands-on how to speak power to the government and being clear that we are fighting for our community and not giving up, not backing down, and also how to speak to members of our community to encourage them to engage.
Wow.
Eric, if I can just say briefly, this really begins for me as an infant. I'm a child who was born to a mom who was 15 when she got pregnant. I couldn't walk. I had bone infections in my legs. And so I didn't really walk till I was 5 years old. So I was what I consider, that was a Marvel story in its own. My mother was smart enough to get me back to the hospital and get orthopedic surgeons who did surgery on me. And that sense of having someone else care for me, my cousins would carry me on their hips from down the street to make sure that I was always included in everything. And so that little boy from Pauls Valley, Oklahoma, who grew up in some worlds would say was handicapped early on in his life. I understand what it's like to be treated different and also what it's like to be accepted and to be loved. For me, that's how I see all of the inequities in our community, those things that have control over, being a witness and engaging to try to make a difference. And it comes from a place of my heart, how I can help my community. I believe it's my voice, my academic training, the influence that social justice leaders and thinkers have had on me. I believe that with all of my heart. As Garvey said in 1921, I believe that some of us must die in order for us to move on. If that means me dying in order for it to be better for my community, I made a commitment that I would lay myself on sword for that. So I lived out of those experiences and those teachers, the Baldwins, the Malcolm X's, the Garveys, the Dr. Kings, the Dr. Joseph Lowry's. Those have all influenced me, Maya Angelou, all influenced how I think and see the world, how I use my power and my influence. This is what I got from them, the energy that if it's just you, do it. Don't be afraid.
I can see why you make sure that you call out your mother, because you had the base for it. You had the base to receive that type of knowledge.
Absolutely. My mom was a nursing pioneer in her own right. And I'm so happy we're going to be able to do this next year. I finally convinced the hospital in Southern Oklahoma, they're going to name a wing after my mother. She integrated the hospitals in Southern Oklahoma. My mother was a pioneer herself. She was going to work every day, working and cleaning up white folks who would call her nigger, but she would go every day. The nurses during her training, white nurses would give her the worst jobs. They didn't know this, but they were making me a stronger nurse. I was a better nurse because they gave me the shittiest jobs to do, the worst patients. And guess what? It made me stronger. And so, yes, I'm absolutely a reflection of my mom in regards to her care for the community. At 80 years old, she's still trying to figure out ways to give information and pass out healthcare information, running her own nonprofit. So I am absolutely a reflection of her spirit, her determination. That's who she is. She loves our community.
As the saying goes, the apple didn't fall far from the tree.
At all. At all. Did not, absolutely.
Yeah. I love that. I'm kind of absorbing that. But when you were sharing about what you were doing during the 80s and the 90s with education and helping those in our community with HIV and AIDS, for you, what was your self-care, your emotional, psychological self-care? Because that was during a period of time when a lot of people were afraid to do that.
Right. And every day I felt like I was walking into a new space where I had to come out as a gay man. Every space I was in, and particularly in the 1989, I was hired by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to lead a faith-based HIV/AIDS organization at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, working with Dr. Joseph Lowry and Evelyn Lowry Gibson, his wife. And so initially, I don't think that I had much of a self-care. I had loose connections with Black gay men in other cities, Phil Wilson, who's an icon, and my dear big brother, and others around the country, Reggie Williams, who's another icon. These guys are my big brothers. I love them dearly. I can name a whole bunch of names, and then you start seeing me cry in a minute because I'm about ready to do that right now. So I didn't have much of a self-care practice. Well, I went to Washington, D.C. one weekend, Howard homecoming, Morehouse Howard football game. So I went there with a good friend. We drove over there. This is like a 9-hour drive. We get to DC for an entire weekend. We're having a great time. On the Sunday night, I go to something called the Black Gay Chat. Rick Irick and Ira Palmer, I believe is his name. Those two gentlemen are giants in DC. They were on Sunday evenings doing a Black Gay Chat discussion. I sat in the bar that night watching them having discussions around. The theme was like, when did your mama know? Or it was topical. It could be funny, but it was a way to get people to talk. I was talking to my friends, we could do this in Atlanta. This is something we really can do in Atlanta. And for a 9-hour drive back to Atlanta, I was talking about how I was going to start this group. I'm going to start an organization. And so by the time I get to Atlanta, I thought of the theme Second Sunday, to meet the second Sunday of the month, Black Gay discussion group. I talked to a few community elders, other brothers that I knew, came up with about 10 names, people I invited to my home in Atlanta to talk about the idea of discussion group, support group for men. The first meeting happened at my house. It was potluck. There may have been 40 guys crammed into my condo. Ended up growing so large that we had to move into a space of a center. But Essex Hemphill talked about, wanting to create an organization to save my life. Ford and Chrysler can be saved, and certainly the lives of Black gay men can be saved. And so I had to create an organization for my self-care to see Black gay men coming to Second Sunday who I knew from the gym and other spaces, I knew that they weren't out. But to see them come to Second Sunday and a month later, they volunteered to facilitate the next meeting and to bring a discussion, or come back a year later and see these same guys who talked about the fact that I had locks, and all of a sudden they're growing their hair and they're twisting it. You know, you can see this evolution. It's making me smile because what I see is another group of people surrounding me who are now out and open. And that's the support that I needed to create an organization of individuals who were evolving, freeing themselves from those shackles, from those systems that had enslaved them, you know, be religion or family practices or family expectations, all those things in society that had held them down. They were re-examining them and able to say what works best for them. And so that's how I began to create an organization and a system for my own survival. Second Sunday was that for me.
Is it going still in some ways, either digitally or in person?
Well, digitally, you know, we just celebrated 30 years 2 years ago. So the organization doesn't exist in the same level of activity that it existed in the 90s.
Okay. Yeah, I saw the podcast. I'm going to start listening to some of the episodes, or just
Yes.
subscribe to it, actually.
I'll tell you, there was something that happened in 2001, which is, I think, the next iteration of Second Sunday. There was a conference that I hosted that was at Brown University. I wanted to host a conference on the Ivy League campus, bringing Black gay thought leaders from around the country and the world, 300 Black gay men that came to this conference for about 1 week on the campus. They lived in the dorms. We had forums and lectures, and we had featured speakers like Reverend Jessie Jackson and Congresswoman from the Virgin Islands, Congresswoman Christian Christensen, and others. And I'm now 20 plus years later, I might pop in on Zoom doing some kind of workshop or something. Well, you did Brown University. So you see this other iteration of young people who are being impacted by something that happened 20 years ago that they weren't part of, but these individuals that were part of that are now doing amazing things in their own right, who were influenced by the Brown Conference. So we just try to plant the seeds where we can plant them.
What I've learned about you so far, I think of, I can't remember his name, I saw the documentary, The Black Godfather. Because I'm like, why don't I know about you? Like, I know more about you. This person that when you hear the name, and then later on, I'm like, oh, he was over there. He was over here. He was over there.
A dear friend of mine, Keith Boykin, we've been friends for over 30 years. Historically, there's not any events in the last 30 years or significant events that Black gay men will participate in. You don't see a fingerprint or two from one or both of us or Phil Wilson. So certainly since 1994, from 1993, gays and lesbians in the military, when the Clinton administration, I was the spokesperson for the Black gay community. You know, if there were actions that happened in Washington around prevention or treatment or care, I was involved, engaged in that. The first Black gay meeting that happened at the King Center was convened by me, myself, and of course, Dr. Lowry. Nothing happens during that time with Dr. Lowry and Mrs. King, you know, being a part of it, but it was Dr. Lowry and Mrs. King that called that meeting, and the list of people that were invited were people that I knew. And of course, I was working for Lowry. I was his assistant chief of staff, as well as running his HIV/AIDS program. So those individuals taught me how to call meetings, convene meetings, and make sure that the most significant, important people were there. And the most important thing is make sure there was going to be something impactful and an outcome out of that. But that time period was a teaching moment for me. The National Black Justice, which was founded over 20 years ago, that came out of a conversation that Keith Boykin and I were having in Soho. Sure, there are board members that are a part of that, but the Rolodex of those names came out of our conversation in Soho. It was an anniversary of one of the Million Man Marches.
Okay.
The Million Man March, Black gay participation in that. People may not know my name right now, but it certainly contributed to our community in some immeasurable ways, I believe.
National Black Justice Coalition, because I remember around the time when I was starting to see press for it, And yeah, to see that your name is connected to that at the time and even today, because I follow them on social media. I may have been following the Human Rights Campaign around the same time, but when that came onto the scene, when you all founded that organization, for me, that was probably around the time that I had been out for maybe 4 or 5 years at that point, but was starting to encourage myself to ask these questions of like, I'm not seeing it, Black folks who I know are making a difference. I'm not seeing them out in the forefront. And so when that came up, I think you said earlier, when we see ourselves or people that look like us, it helps us. It helps me to believe in myself, to believe in the possibilities. So yeah.
Visibility matters and presence matters. You know, I certainly support the work of HRC and NGLTF and Lambda Legal. All those organizations, I think, have made significant impact on the liberation of gay folks. But I think it's something special about an organization like the National Black Justice Coalition. It's been in existence now over 20 years. There's something that's special about an organization that looks like you, that's embedded in sort of a Black identity, not a gay identity, but a Black identity. You know, years ago, Dr. Lowry said, when America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And so when you think about the needs that we have in our community, whether you're gay, bisexual, or heterosexual, the things that come to my mind immediately is housing, education, access, equity, and having an organization that's, you know, centered in that, even with its collaboration with other national NGOs, is able to make sure that there's a message centered around the needs of our community specifically. Certainly, we want to advance liberation ideas of marriage or other issues that impact and should be the same from state to state. But certainly, as the white gay community continues to evolve around their specific needs, we don't want them to forget that there are some needs that are more significant and more impactful to members of the Black gay community.
Speaking of, I didn't ask you when you mentioned education. I know you mentioned university in Oklahoma, but what did you study?
Well, while I was at the University of Oklahoma, I studied everything, Eric. I was all over the place when I was at OU. So initially, I can't remember what I started studying there, but primarily I was a Bachelor of Fine Arts. I was studying dance and theater. I just knew Eric, that I was going to be this major American actor. Sidney Poitier and all of those greats were who Harry Belafonte. I went to performing arts high school. And so I really wanted to do theater. I wanted to be an actor. That's my love and my passion. While everybody was watching Roots in my hometown for that full week, I was in the theater rehearsing and performing for a play. So I didn't see it like everyone else saw it. I had to see it later. And so my first love was the theater, but the epidemic shifted that for me. And the interesting thing is I talked to a lot of my elders and individuals who, what I consider the first fire marshals in attendance during HIV and AIDS. And turns out that we all have something in common. It was the theater or dance. We were bringing joy to people's lives through theater. Mm-hmm. My mentor, George Bellinger, was at Howard University, dance. Phil Wilson was on the West Coast, but he was also involved in theater. And we all shifted, and perhaps that was a training ground for us because we early on knew and that were prepared to do things even when it was against what our families, I was already had been talking about. Boy, does he look like he's gonna ever graduate, or sure does like to dance and sing a lot. How are you gonna make a living doing all that? But you kept doing it. And so that meant that I feel like I'm strong enough to do whatever it is I want to do. My family raised a strong child.
Yeah. But you were a medic in the military.
Yes.
Okay.
So in high school and throughout my childhood, elementary, I was a Boy Scout.
Oh, okay.
And a wrestler. I was a state champion in Oklahoma as a wrestler. But I was really what you would consider sort of this high adventure overachieving kid. So I spent my summers at summer camps. I wasn't a football player. I was the trainer. So initially, I did start at Oklahoma wanting to be a physiologist. I wanted to be a football trainer and perhaps a professional football trainer. But during that time period, there was only so many slots on the campus for football trainers. And it didn't seem like there was a possibility that I would ever get a chance to do that. And so I shifted from physical therapy to theater, going into the United States Navy as a medic. For me, that made sense. I mean, that was, something that I had an interest in medicine and caring for other individuals.
Now, if I understand correctly, you've been out all or most of your professional career.
All of my professional career, I've been out.
Okay.
I was out in the Navy. I was certainly openly gay in the United States Navy and in college. I've been out as a Black gay man since maybe 18 or 19 years old.
Okay.
I met some interesting people on the campus, University of Oklahoma, white gay men who sort of embraced me. And they always had these interesting things going on campus. It's the Ingmar Bergman Film Festival. I forgot what the name of the white gay organization was, but they would invite me and they always wanted to make sure that I was there. They'd always have a back door so I could come in and sit right down in the very front and so that nobody would see me. Well, the white gay community knew that I was out. Then I began to get a little bit more active with them because they were what they call talk on campus. We were talking for student resources so that the gay organization on campus could receive the same amount of money other organizations receiving. And so I would walk with them and talk on campus. And I felt a little bit like I was talking, but mostly like I was their security. Like if they needed muscle, I was there to make sure nobody would mess with them. And of course, the Oklahoma white gay organization brought the first case that went all the way to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not gay and lesbian organizations on campus were entitled to resource dollars. Yes, that was really how I came out on campus. And of course, in the Navy, I don't think I ever really felt like I was ever in. I had a secretary on campus in the Navy, and she's like, "You need to tell that girl you're gay. She keeps coming in here, and you need to let her know." And I thought, all right, Miss Wilma, I'll say something.
Yeah.
I felt like there were so many people surrounding me with so much love that how could they created such an environment, an incubator space of support for me. So with that, it's easy to tell your truth. When you feel supported, it was easy for me to share my truth.
Yeah, I feel like a movie needs to be made about you.
Oh, wow. Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Quick story. At the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there were, again, people like Donald Woods and Essex and Joseph Beam and Bishop Carl Beam, but there were these conferences, they had these national conferences. And my dear friend Craig Harris, who passed in 92, every time we go to a conference, Craig would walk down the center of the aisle to the very front. And I would walk down there and he would kiss me on the lips. Mm-hmm. Now, did I want to get kissed on the lips during that time period? I was still struggling with public affection. Mm-hmm. But because I worked for SCLC and he was my friend, I felt like I had to do this. We had to do this. I had to get over myself. And so I would go down front and kiss him on the lips every conference. That was sort of our public ritual. And there were Black gay men who would do that as part of our public ritual. And the kinds of things that we did to, I guess, speaking truth to power, but also that love that dare not say its name. We were letting people know that we were here, that we're part of the community, and that whether or not they affirmed us or not, we affirm each other.
Yeah, being public and unapologetically, that was the thing that impressed me, was reading your credentials, working with the Southern Leadership Conference. Also, like you being an advisor for several mayors.
Again, many of these mayors, if you think about Mayor Berry and specifically, and think about his work as Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, his involvement with SNCC, and I could name others. Julian Bond was, I consider him to be one of my god uncles. You think about these leaders and the involvement they had in the movies of the 60s. It makes sense that, openly gay Black men, young Black men who is in their midst, they would encourage support. It just makes sense. At the time, I was honored to be a part of their circle and for them to trust me and give me responsibilities in terms of their campaigns or on social policy issues is with Mayor Berry was around health-related social policy. Mayor Mike Rollins, it was around poverty and housing issues in Dallas. And of course, Bill Campbell, I consulted, it was primarily around issues that were impactful to the gay and lesbian community. Mm-hmm. But when you think about their own histories, it makes sense that they were embedded in social justice within the South. I showed up at a time when the environment was right, when these leaders were there to receive me and then to elevate me in some sense. What they were doing was elevating me and mirroring to me, these are some of the challenges we need to embrace our children and to charge them on forward to the next generation. Certainly that's what Marion Berry did, and that's certainly what Bill Campbell did.
It dispels what we hear a lot publicly, that Black people are more homophobic, especially, Black straight men. You are sharing examples of these men, these public figures who saw you as a person, saw your talent, saw your gifts.
Certainly those individuals were very supportive. But I've certainly been in spaces where Black gay men were not supported. Mm-hmm. But I believe, that I've never left home. I'm here, Spirit. You're not going to deny me, Spirit. All right, listen, we can have this conversation if you want to, Spirit. But I'm not going anywhere, Spirit. Certainly, it's not been without its challenges. I'm very clear about, my identity, my Blackness. And the story of Black, gay, and lesbians, historically, we stay in the community. We share resources. And sometimes we raise children in our community that are not ours. There's lots of history, how we help our community survive. Mm. My mother tells me she grew up in the 50s and 60s, and she says she never heard anything negative about gay folks until around the 70s. Coming from a rural community, I know all the gay people in the town I came from. Mm-hmm. And when I think about it, I don't ever remember hearing any real stories about that till maybe the late 70s, when maybe somebody might have called me a sissy, And so some of that is, and same thing with Africa. Look at the evangelical movement in the 40s and how it moved into Africa. Mm. And so you saw the same kind of evangelical movement start to impact Black America around that same time, so from the 40s to the 70s. But, I don't read any stories, or I haven't read any stories recently to talk about same-sex love, how the community was against it in the 1800s or the early turn of the century. You hear about balls in the 1920s and in Harlem. And I think some of this is a construct that evangelical Christianity has impacted the diaspora. It's like a virus that attacked our community, and that we're working to shred ourselves of this idea that one cannot have love for someone who looks like them.
Speaking of Africa, I know when we connected a few days ago, you've been on the continent for work in different countries. But how did that start, and when did you first come to the continent?
So I had some experience in the military in Africa. But I want to say that my first real experiences came with Dr. Joseph Lowery of Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Mm-hmm. That was just a magical time for me, being able to travel with a leader who was respected worldwide. And so it could be on a flight to Joburg on a Wednesday with Dr. Lowery, visiting and meeting with leaders in South Africa. And it could be on a flight back and be back in Atlanta at 6 o'clock in the morning. So he had 3 services to do at church, and he made all of the services. So that's the kind of leader. This man was in his late 60s and his 70s when I met him. And so those are my experiences with Dr. Lowery. When Mandela came to Atlanta, I was fortunate enough to have been in rooms and with Dr. Lowery in the whole march on Auburn Avenue. When he walked down Auburn Avenue, I was with Dr. Lowery and with Nelson Mandela. Those were my experiences on the continent, was primarily with Dr. Lowery. I haven't had an experience on the continent on a vacation or a cultural trip of my own yet.
Okay. I have one question that came up, especially because of you being somebody who's been your authentic self as a Black gay man. Like, when you started on your journey as an adult, what was your perception in the beginning as a Black gay man? What you knew of being gay before you fully acknowledge that part of yourself?
My perception of community was that I could be a masculine man who would go to the club, and if I wanted to twirl and jete and dance and throw my legs up and dance as a ballad, I could do all of that.
Mm.
That did not impact anyone's idea of my masculinity, and it certainly didn't impact my idea of my masculinity.
Mhm.
I will say that the HIV/AIDS epidemic certainly challenged that. This is the last question you're trying to ask me, but you have to open up a can now, so I'll just take that a little further. So the AIDS epidemic really began to challenge individuals' masculinity, and we see this hyper-masculine actors in our community. So you created these sort of hyper macho identities around gayness. That meant that I was a man, that I'm not a sissy, that I must be okay. And so you saw that feminine Black gay men demonized during that same time period. Before HIV and AIDS, we see Black gay men who I see are much more fluid around their sexuality and their sexual orientation. You could be, intellectual, or a snap finger queen diva if you wanted to be, or all of these things. You could be all of who you were. AIDS challenged and began to sort of compartmentalize people's identities. People did that in order to protect themselves, and I think that in itself created more silence and more death in our community.
Mm.
But for me, I was right in the middle of it as this young kid coming out. I saw how it was impacting the community. And I certainly saw how it was turning on me as I was being elevated in leadership, that it was turning on me because those same guys that would have been my friends were walking away from me because I was out and fluid.
Mm.
That was a period of the 80s and certainly the 90s. The 90s, so probably about 97, 98, I think we saw a lot of that. Hip hop didn't help our communities, create a hyper masculine environment for men. So dress, language, the culture.
With you being on the front lines, literally and figuratively, what would you say it's like today?
Today's generation, I have a lot of hope for them. I'd certainly believe in the iterations of stronger, bigger, faster, that they will take what we've done and create better society and better communities. It's saddened because I don't think they know the history and the work that many of us have done. Many of us need to tell our story, write books, get that information out, certainly. So we have responsibility in making sure that the history is told and people know the history. So I'm just responsible for that as anyone else, and ensuring that my message and my story gets out there. But the will was not created this year or last year, 20 years ago. And the work that we did and that I did started in the 80s, started well before that with Baldwin and Langston Hughes and County Cullen and Elaine Locke. But it was the work that they did that advanced the work that I do. But the fact is, I know their names. So this generation has to do a little bit of research. I'm glad that they're doing all the wonderful things they do. I see the work and I see them. And one thing I can say is, let me see if I can say this right. The South African term, it's called, I think it's Sawubona. I see you. I feel you. I hear you. I see all of the work that they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for this talk. At certain points, I was like, I'm going to go online and look at some of these people you've talked about. A lot of them I know about, but it's like, see if I can see you in the background.
They all deserve a treatment. Those individuals. Oh, goodness, Eric, don't make me do this right now. They've done so much to enrich my life.
Mm.
These ancestors, I call their names every time I get a chance. When I go to dance and house music, I'm calling the names of my ancestors. They made it safe for me to be out. They made it safe for me. When they showed up and I was there, I felt like I didn't have to be the social activist warrior. I can just be the little brother in the kid in the room. I'm not by myself in Atlanta. I'm surrounded by my big brothers. They got this. I can just sit back and watch today. But when it's my time to work, those are the same guys that would call me, and ladies, Sabrina Sojourn and others, who would call me to make sure that everything I needed to know, that my muscle was up and I was ready. Those are the people those are the individuals that I think about daily because they did so much for me. So thank you so much.
part of the format is in, which is asking if you have any final thoughts or insights. I think you shared that, but just always put that out there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you again. And if there's a part 2 to this, let's do that next.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And where can we interact with you online?
You can find me on Facebook at Dr. Mo Frank. Also on Instagram, Dr. Mo Frank. Twitter, we call it any other name now, but the same thing, Dr. Mo Frank.
Okay, cool.
Of course, I have my own website. It's drmauricefranklin.com. You're giving voice to individuals in our community that people should know that they don't know. And so I have some other names of people I think you should talk to. Hope you get an opportunity to talk to them.
Thank you for spending time with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, comment, and subscribe. Share with your friends too. You can also follow us on Instagram at Our Black Gay Diaspora and on Twitter at BLK Gay Diaspora. Until next time.